Shyla was not used to surprises. In fact, she would go so far as to say that surprises were for the weak, those unprepared for the reality of space. And after decades of being a soldier in the Queen's army, Shyla had long since stopped expecting anything other than the predictable grind of warfare. She knew the way of the galaxy: conquer, destroy, claim. It had always been that way. The prisoner, however, was supposed to be a different kind of surprise, or so her superior had claimed. The human was to be kept in isolation until he was needed for interrogation. But even before the orders arrived, Shyla knew he would be a problem. Human prisoners had a tendency to defy expectations, as though they were born with an innate talent for finding the one thing that would make the most sense to challenge. It was almost like they had a sixth sense for the absurd. So when Shyla walked into the observation room to inspect the human prisoner, she was mentally prepared for chaos. The stories had been spun like some kind of legend. This human was supposed to be a monster, a beast who fought with the savagery of 100 creatures. She expected wild eyes, snarling, a creature whose very presence threatened the order she had sworn to uphold. What she found instead was a man sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, his back straight as though he were meditating. His eyes were closed, but there was an unsettling stillness to him, as though he were waiting for something, maybe her. "Are you going to just sit there and stare at me, or will you speak?" The voice was calm, too calm for someone who should have been terrified, according to the reports. Shyla blinked. That was not what she expected. "I was just about to say hello," she said, stepping forward, her boots clicking sharply on the metallic floor. The man, his name was Elias, according to the database, opened his eyes slowly, studying her with a gaze that held none of the fear she had anticipated. His gaze was steady, unblinking, and for a brief second, Shyla found herself surprised by the lack of animosity in his stare. "You're not what I expected," he said, tilting his head slightly. That made Shyla pause. "I could say the same about you. I was told to expect an out-of-control monster." Elias chuckled, a soft, amused sound. "Well, I suppose you're in for a disappointment then. I'm not in the mood for a fight, and to be honest, it's a little too cold for that." She blinked again. Cold. The temperature in the cell was always the same, artificially controlled and frankly uncomfortable for everyone but her. "What exactly do you think you're doing in here?" He shrugged, the movement almost nonchalant. "Meditating, trying to clear my head before whatever comes next." "Clear your head? You're in a prison, and you're trying to meditate?" Shyla couldn't help herself. The absurdity of it was just too much. "Is this some kind of human coping mechanism?" "Not really," he said, still not looking at her. "But it helps me think, which, when you're dealing with, well, whatever this is probably a good idea. I find that panic never really solves anything." Shyla crossed her arms, leaning against the wall, trying to ignore the uncomfortable shift in her own posture. "You're supposed to be an enemy of the Queen. Don't you care at all about where you are?" "Not really," he replied, his voice flat, as though they were talking about nothing at all. "I mean, I'd prefer not to be in prison, but I've been in worse places, and at least the food here is better than the last place." "Better?" Shyla's tone dripped with skepticism. "This place has the most bland rations in the galaxy. There's a reason we call them nutrient bricks. They're not meant to be gourmet." He raised an eyebrow. "Trust me, I've had worse. Ever eaten a ration that tasted like burnt metal and regret? That's what I had for a month once. This place is practically a luxury suite by comparison." Shyla had to fight the laugh that threatened to escape. "You're an odd one, aren't you?" "That's what they tell me," Elias said with a smile, the first real one she had seen on his face. It was strange, disarming even. "But I suppose you get to be odd when you're busy surviving." Surviving. That word hung in the air between them like a puzzle piece she didn't know how to place. In all her years as a soldier, she had never thought about survival beyond the fight, beyond the orders given to her. It had never occurred to her that someone like him might survive without being caught up in the same endless cycle of violence that defined her existence. "I was told you were dangerous," Shyla said after a moment, her voice more serious now, "that you had a special skill." Ilias shrugged again, but this time the gesture seemed less dismissive. Special skill? I suppose I'm good at staying alive. That's about it. Staying alive, Shyla echoed, confused. What's so special about that? Isn't that just basic instinct? Not when the universe is trying to kill you at every turn. Trust me, staying alive requires some creative thinking. He looked up at her, his gaze no longer just calm, but piercing, like he could see straight through her. You should try it sometime. Might help you see things differently. Shyla opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but something about what he said felt important. You really think you can change the way I see things? She asked, her tone softening against her will. Elise's smile returned, more knowing now. Maybe not, but if you don't even try, you'll never know. And that's the problem, isn't it? You've never really asked yourself if the things you've been told are true, have you? That was a challenge, a direct hit, one that pierced something deep inside Shyla. Her entire existence had been shaped by the orders she had followed, by the beliefs she had absorbed since birth. Never once had she questioned the truth. But now, standing in front of this calm, non-threatening prisoner, she found herself wondering, was it possible that everything she had been told was wrong? Before she could respond, Elias tilted his head and gave her a small smile. Look, I'm just saying, if you want to know the truth, you might want to start by asking the right questions. Otherwise, you might just miss it. Shyla stared at him for a long moment, her mind spinning. She had never met anyone like him. He was too calm, too collected, too different from the raving, aggressive enemies she had been trained to fight. Finally, she straightened. I'll be back tomorrow, she said curtly, turning to leave the cell. As she walked away, Elias's voice stopped her. And Shyla? She turned, one eyebrow raised. Don't forget to ask yourself that question, he said, his voice light, almost teasing. You might just find something worth thinking about. For the first time, Shyla wasn't sure whether she wanted to hear more. Shyla had never been particularly fond of silence. In her line of work, silence was a warning, a harbinger of danger or a precursor to unexpected chaos. It was a space that allowed thoughts to creep in, thoughts that didn't have answers, and lately those thoughts seemed to always lead back to Elias. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had spoken to her, his calmness, his seemingly unshakable composure. The questions he had posed, they buzzed in her mind like a relentless drone, demanding her attention even when she tried to focus on something else. The steady hum of the ship, the rhythm of her patrol, the orders she followed, all of it had become a blur. Even the smell of nutrient bricks didn't seem to bother her as much anymore. It wasn't until the third day after their first conversation that she found herself walking back to his cell, against her better judgment. She had promised herself she wouldn't entertain his ideas, that she would remain professional, keep her distance. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, like he saw more than just a soldier. It gnawed at her. It shouldn't have, but it did. Back again, huh? Elias's voice rang out as she approached the cell. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his legs crossed. A standard pose for prisoners, though Shyla couldn't quite reconcile the peaceful aura he carried with the idea of someone locked up for a rebellion. Don't get too excited, I'm just doing my job, she replied, even though the words felt hollow the moment they left her mouth. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Elias looked up at her, a glint of humor dancing in his eyes. I don't think I've ever seen someone so determined to not enjoy their job. Shyla narrowed her eyes, but she couldn't suppress the faintest hint of a smile. I enjoy it just fine, she muttered. It's what I've trained for. Sure, Elias said, clearly unconvinced. You know, if you're really good at something, it shouldn't feel like a chore. Just saying. Shyla leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or intrigued. And what exactly would you know about being good at something? I've been really good at surviving, Elias said, his tone light but serious. Which, by the way, is an underrated skill, keeps you alive long enough to do all the fun stuff. Fun stuff? Shyla raised an eyebrow. Like being captured by the Queen's forces? Exactly, he said, the smile tugging at the corner of his lips again. You know, it's not often that I get to meet someone who's so eager to stay on the other side of things. I mean, the Queen's soldiers don't exactly have the best reputation for open-mindedness. Shyla found herself laughing before she could stop it. I'm not sure I'd call it open-mindedness. More like following orders without questioning. There it is, Elias said, raising his hand in mock celebration. That's the part where I get to say, I told you so. It's like you've been trained to shut off your brain whenever someone says, do this, do that. I haven't shut off anything, Shyla snapped, but there was no real heat behind her words. Instead, she found herself curious. Why did he keep saying things like that? Why did he always question her, always make her wonder? Look, Elias, you don't know anything about my life. You don't know how it works out here. He didn't flinch. I know that you're here, and that means you've been caught up in something bigger than yourself, just like the rest of us. I don't have to know everything to know that. For a long moment, Shyla said nothing. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had a way of distilling everything down to the bare truth, and that always made it harder to ignore the gnawing discomfort in her chest. You're not even scared of me, are you? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Ilias shook his head slowly. Nope. I've met worse. She let out a short laugh, genuinely surprised. Worse? What could possibly be worse than the Queen's soldiers? Elias's grin spread wider, and for the first time she saw the true depth of his amusement. Oh, you'd be amazed. Some of the things I've run into would make your eyes pop out of your skull. I mean, have you ever heard of the Banthrax? Shyla stared at him, momentarily thrown off course. The Banthrax? That's a myth. It's just something the rebels made up to scare people. Sure, sure, Elias said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Just like the nocturnal raptors of Andromeda and the devourers of the fourth moon, all made up to keep the little soldiers in line. Shyla rolled her eyes. You really expect me to believe that? Elias shrugged. Believe what you want, but the Banthrax? Real as you are. They eat anything that moves, and they're pretty fond of chasing down spaceships. You know, for sport. Her mind was racing. You're not serious. I swear I'm not pulling your leg. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, you learn to be a little creative with how you stay alive. There it was again. That word. Survive. The way Elias used it so casually, as if it were just part of everyday life. Shyla had never had to think about survival beyond the scope of her training, but Elias, he lived it. He breathed it. He saw things differently. I still don't get it, she said, folding her arms tighter, her thoughts churning. Why do you keep talking to me like this? Why not just wait for your trial or whatever? You're supposed to be the enemy, remember? He met her gaze steadily, that same serene calm in his eyes. Maybe because I don't think I'm your enemy. Maybe I'm just someone who's stuck in a bad situation, just like you. Shyla didn't know how to respond to that. She was supposed to see him as a threat. He was the enemy, after all. But all she saw was a man who seemed oddly at peace, despite everything that had happened to him. It made no sense, and yet the more she thought about it, the more it unsettled her. You're not what I expected, she muttered, mostly to herself. Elias grinned again. I get that a lot. Shyla found herself shaking her head, a rueful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I don't know whether to hate you or start taking notes. Hey, I'm just here for the entertainment, Elias said, his tone light, but his eyes never leaving hers. Maybe a little perspective along the way wouldn't hurt either. She didn't have an answer to that. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, uncertain of what to make of him, of the strange calm that seemed to radiate from him, like some kind of cosmic joke she wasn't getting. I'll see you tomorrow, Shyla said at last, turning away. Elias's voice stopped her. You know, Shyla, you really ought to start thinking for yourself. It's a hell of a lot more fun than just following orders. She paused, turning slightly to look back at him. Maybe, but it's a lot riskier, Elias shrugged. Sometimes the best things are. And just like that, she was walking away, her mind racing, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she was more scared of the enemy in her custody or the enemy inside her head. The hum of the ship had become more of a background murmur now. Shyla barely noticed it anymore, her thoughts drifting through the corridors like a wayward vessel on a slow, uncharted course. It had been 3 weeks since the first conversation with Elias, and everything in her world had shifted. The orders were still the same. The mission still came down with the weight of inevitability, but there was something different in the way she approached them. She had thought the prisoner, this human, would be just another notch on the tally of captured enemies. Another body to interrogate, another life to erase from the map. But instead, she had found herself questioning everything she knew. And that was not something Shyla was used to. The Queen's forces had been closing in on the rebel stronghold for months, but something about it all seemed hollow now, like chasing shadows in the dark. She had grown used to seeing the rebellion as the enemy, the cause of everything wrong in the galaxy. But now, after everything Elias had said, after the countless hours spent listening to his thoughts on survival, freedom, and purpose, she wasn't sure where the line between enemy and ally truly lay. Shyla found herself standing outside Elias's cell again, the door silently sliding open as she approached. She had come to realize that this was no longer about keeping him imprisoned. It wasn't about extracting information or extracting vengeance. It was something else, something deeper. Inside, Elias was sitting at his usual spot, cross-legged, calm. If there was one thing that hadn't changed since their first meeting, it was his uncanny ability to remain grounded in the face of everything. If she had been in his shoes, she would have gone mad by now, or at least tried to escape. But Elias had done neither. He was peaceful, too peaceful. "Back again?" he asked without opening his eyes, his voice a familiar, easy rhythm. Shyla leaned against the doorframe. "I can't stay away. You make it too hard to ignore you." He finally opened his eyes, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Oh, I knew I was irresistible," Shyla smirked, despite herself. "That's the last thing I'd call you." "You're just playing hard to get," he said with a wink, his smile widening. She rolled her eyes, but there was a warmth in her chest, something unfamiliar. It had been so long since she had let herself feel anything but duty and obedience. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer than usual, "about everything you've said, about the rebellion, about the Queen, about survival." "Ah, the great existential crisis of Shyla the Invincible," Elias teased. "I knew this was coming. I should have brought snacks." She frowned. "This isn't a joke. I'm serious." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying, if you need a distraction, I've got all sorts of tales. You wouldn't believe the time I outsmarted a Canarian bounty hunter using nothing but a rusty spoon and a piece of string." Shyla crossed her arms, though there was a reluctant chuckle that escaped her lips. "Maybe later. This isn't about your ridiculous stories." All right. I'll put my comedic genius on hold. What's going on in that brilliant brain of yours?" She sighed, looking down at her boots. "I don't know anymore. I used to think everything was so simple. There were the Queen soldiers, and there were the rebels. We fought, we conquered. That was it. But now it feels like there's no clear side anymore. I'm not sure I even know what I'm fighting for." Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression serious for the first time in weeks. "And that scares you, doesn't it?" "It's not the uncertainty that scares me," she said quietly. "It's the idea that maybe I've been on the wrong side this whole time." The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. But then Elias spoke, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Shyla, there's no right side in a war. There's just survival. And survival's a funny thing. You can do it by following orders, but it's never going to give you meaning." "Not really." She looked up at him, searching his face for some hint of mockery, but there was none. Just a quiet sincerity that made her stomach churn with something unfamiliar. "What do you mean by meaning?" "Meaning's what you make of it," he said with a shrug. "Look, I don't know what's going on in that big shiny palace of a mind of yours, but I know one thing. You can't just live your whole life being told what to do. If you want something more, something real, you've got to decide for yourself." "Are you trying to give me advice?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and amusement. "From a prison cell?" "I'm just here to offer perspective," Elias replied with a grin. "Trust me, I've seen the galaxy from places far worse than this, and I've survived. So can you." The word stung, but in a way she couldn't quite explain. Survival isn't the problem, she said, her voice shaking slightly. It's what happens after. What happens when you realize everything you thought you knew was wrong? Elias's expression softened, and for the first time Shyla saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. That's when the real fight begins. She blinked, thrown off balance. The real fight? Yeah, Elias said. The one you fight with yourself, with your choices. It's the one that lasts long after the war's over. Shyla stared at him for a long time, unsure of what to say. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, but one thing had become clear. Elias had been right about one thing. There was no real side to this war, no black and white morality, just choices. Choices that shaped who you became, not just what you fought for. A soft alarm suddenly blared throughout the ship, cutting through the stillness of the room. It was a familiar sound, an alert that signaled an attack was imminent. Looks like it's showtime, Elias said, getting to his feet with a wry smile. Tell me, Shyla, you ever been in a real fight? She didn't answer immediately. The weight of what he had said hung in the air, pressing down on her. But as the ship's alarm continued to blare and her training kicked in, she finally straightened. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. But we're not doing this the old way? Elias raised an eyebrow. Now we're talking. Shyla stood taller than she had in days, the weight of her decisions settling into her bones like a new kind of armor. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was making the choice for herself. No more blindly following orders. No more being a pawn in someone else's game. As she left the room, heading toward the command center, Elias's voice echoed in her mind. The real fight begins when you decide for yourself. And Shyla knew, whatever came next, she had already won the only battle that truly mattered.